This is Illuminate, the podcast about men with good hearts, open minds, and a desire to make the world better. Welcome to Illuminate. I'm your host, Chris Tidrick, and I'm here with Jason Kolaczkowski. Jason is a husband and a father to twin 10-year-old boys. He has spent over 2 decades in analytics leadership roles, primarily in healthcare, and has also led in high-consequence environments as a high-altitude climber in places like Alaska, the Andes, and the Himalaya. He and his boys have a YouTube channel called Short Guys Beta Works, where they provide educational videos on the physical, technical, and mental aspects of getting families into the wild. You would think with those kind of hobbies, Jason would be an expert on balancing risks and the short and long-term views of life, but he's here to talk about how he's forever trying to find the right balance. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thanks, Chris. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to start out these episodes with asking you about your motivation. So what's your why? Where do you find purpose and what drives you?
Sure. Well, probably not surprisingly to anyone who has kids, they would recognize that your why tends to shift as soon as that happens. But like most things, I think a recurring theme in our conversation today will be sort of the pendulum swings too far one way and then pull it back. So certainly when the kids were young, my why focused on them and trying to, raise good human beings. And probably, a number of years ago started to realize that, looking too inwardly on the family and not outwardly enough on the community around us, wasn't going to do me any good. It wasn't going to do them any good in the long term. And it certainly wasn't going to help the community, around us. And so really trying to figure out how to, be someone positive, as a father, but also as a neighbor and a community member, in whatever sense of community I happen to be in, whether that's, locally or, climbing community or professional community or whatever it might be.
Yeah. So tell me about your journey, about how you got here. You're, you said you're in your 40s, I think. And you've kind of found your why, but how did you get here?
I think to understand me, you really need to understand two, flashpoints in my life. The first one happened when I was 15. I was just getting ready to start my sophomore year in high school. I had gone out for a long run. I think soccer tryouts were starting at the high school like the next week or something like that. So I was finishing up my training, came back home, and an intruder came into my house and actually attacked me. I was stabbed 5 times with one of those big 9-inch, kitchen blades.
Wow.
You're kind of lucky, one of those millimeter here or there thing. One wound was blocked by my sternum. Another, nicked a lung in my lower back, but didn't, deflate it. You had one in my shoulder, one in my bicep. But anyway, like it could have ended very differently. And I think, the short version of the takeaways from that is, I certainly, now would recognize that I had PTSD. And while that was a thing in, mental health communities back then, this was the mid 90s, early 90s, it really wasn't in the common parlance like it is now. So, as a 15-year-old, I didn't know. But coming out of the really acute form of that, say 6 months, maybe to a year later, I think I actually framed it as something very positive. I sort of abandoned that teenage or young adult notion of, and I think men particularly fall into this, that sort of sense of invincibility, that, nothing's ever going to happen to them, that we're almost indestructible. And I certainly had no illusions about that.
That certainly explains the idiocy of teenagers, right?
Well, to some of us, for sure. And I was that way too. Like I was, I was a soccer player, as I mentioned, and I'm a small man. I'm like 5'6", 140 pounds. And so in high school sports, there were certainly bigger athletes than me, but I was one of those guys who'd go in headlong and, didn't really worry about my body and all that type of stuff. So I had a little bit of that. But then after, the stabbing, it's sort of like, well, yeah, things can happen to all of us. But that eventually got framed as like, well, I have a second chance. And I think that was actually a really positive thing coming out of it, is that, I could have gone into a depression. I could have gone into isolation. I could have backed away from a lot of things. And I didn't do that. I double down on a lot of the stuff that I was passionate about, feeling like I had this, this gifted second chance at life. But I think eventually I kind of bastardized that concept. I didn't see a therapist about it until 15 years later, till I was 30. And, one of the things that I had morphed that initial positive thing into was this more negative conflation of the notion of can with should. Like, just because I can do something, then I should do something, from almost like a moralistic perspective. If I can help this person, then I should. And that led to all sorts of like terrible, like codependent relationships and things like that, where, I could see myself helping someone rather than really taking care of myself in any way. And that wasn't good for them, and it wasn't good for me. And, multiply that across like a whole, gamut of the sort of small moral choices we make in our lives. And I think I turned it into something kind of terrible, to be honest. So if that's one major flashpoint, I think the second one, I'm now almost 48. When I was 41, I was diagnosed with blood cancer, actually a leukemia. Leukemia, normally when you hear that, I think that the things that make it around sort of social media and the documentaries tend to be the acute version of leukemia, which is the one where, the college athlete struck down in their prime, now all of a sudden needs a bone marrow transplant. That's the acute form. I have something called chronic lymphocytic leukemia, which is a B cell leukemia. Very quickly, your T cells are the things that attack the bad substances in your body. Your B cells are the things that train your T cells. So my B cells don't train my T cells quite correctly. But the chronic form, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, or CLL, its median diagnostic age is actually 71 years old. So it tends to hit elderly people. So it's pretty unusual. I was diagnosed when I was 41.
My mother was diagnosed around age 70 with the same thing. So
more of the normal course of things. And on the one hand, being chronic and slow moving, it's sort of, by cancer standards, it's all graded on a curve. It's fairly easy for me physically. Like right now, I have no symptoms. I have no other blood markers that are out of whack. Like my immunoglobulin levels are fine. I'm not anemic. I don't have any, physical symptoms. Like it tends to show up as a swollen spleen, or your lymph nodes can swell up, dramatically, like you would notice as an outside observer, which can be quite painful. But none of that's happening to me yet. It is very likely that it will at some point, because, going 30 years without having any symptoms would be pretty rare. I might have to get written up in a medical journal or something like that.
That would be a good thing.
That would be a good thing. Yeah. I would welcome it, but it seems unlikely. So in that sense, it's sort of physically it's an easy cancer, but mentally it's quite a difficult one, because there is no benefit to early treatment. Like you don't have better outcomes long term, and like most cancer treatments, there are some significant side effects. They're not as bad as they used to be. It's not like typically chemo as the treatment. It's now a series of targeted pills, generally speaking, that you take. But, they can lead to heart arrhythmias or other cardiac problems and lots of fatigue and, other types of issues. So they don't start treatment until you need it. So I'm waiting to be bad enough to get treatment. In some ways, it reminds me of, eventually I tore my knee up playing soccer. I think it was right around 30, right around the time I started seeing a therapist for other reasons. And I remember the hard part about that. Like I was ready for the surgery, and I was ready for the after surgical pain, and I was ready for doing the PT and putting in the work. But the hard part was the point between the injury and the surgery, because I'm just waiting to get worse. And this is like 6 years of waiting to get worse. And that this thing is coming, and it's going to be unpleasant. And it's on the horizon, but you don't know how far on the horizon it is. And so in that sense, it's been more emotionally challenging, more psychologically challenging.
How have you found, what techniques have you used to sort of deal with that?
Well, because I saw a therapist around the stabbing eventually. I remember one of the first things, like I was jotting down notes for my first oncology appointment, and, I need to ask them about mental health resources. I think, one of the truisms that I've stumbled into in my life is that I think vulnerability is truly a strength. It takes a strong person. And, if we're talking about men here specifically, I think it takes, a strong man to be vulnerable. And that's something that our culture doesn't readily embrace yet. I think the conversation around that is changing. But so I think sort of admitting my vulnerability, both physically and emotionally. I have a difficult time communicating, whether that be with my partner or with my children, about that vulnerability. I think that's one of the residual effects of the stabbing, actually, because I held this thing in for 15 years. And so I trained myself to hold things in. And so a lot of my coping mechanisms have been trying to break that non-communicative cycle and being vulnerable to the people who care about me. One of the things that on my best days, I realize, on my worst days, I realize it, but ignore it. On my best days, I realize it and act upon it, is that, again, I trained myself to think, as long as I don't bother people with my own struggles, then, I'm being a good whatever, a good friend, a good son, a good brother, a good spouse, a good, and really what that is denying that person the opportunity to be an equal partner in that relationship. It's like, well, I'll tell me your problems. I'll help you. That'll be me being a good, masculine individual. And if that's only a one-way street, then really I'm denying them the opportunity to, be a partner and help me the way that I'm willing to help them. And so, like I said, on my best days, I realize that and I lean into it. And on my worst days, I don't. But that's a sort of ongoing. And then there's all sorts of like little things to get to the point of your question, like, my therapist, specifically, I sought out a therapist with cognitive behavioral therapy as a background. And so recognizing what my triggers are, being able to go to work and say like, hey, I have an oncology appointment later today. It's not going to be a good day for me. I'm going to check out of some of these meetings that I don't need to be in. Those types of just very tactical behavioral things is another way that I cope with it.
Yeah, being strong and being vulnerable isn't an either or. I mean, there are times when we need to lean into the strength and the resilience piece, but then there's times we need to lean into the vulnerable part. And that can be really confusing. And I think especially confusing for men because there are so many kind of societal expectations around what that looks like or what it's not supposed to look like.
No, I completely agree. I think some of that I've done to myself. Some of it has been trained. I think like many of us in our particular culture as men are trained into some bad habits in that space. But, I own a certain component of that as well. But, it comes from everywhere. It's like, in its most extreme form, we're taught that anger is the only acceptable emotion when things aren't going well. Not that I have a big anger problem, but that's just to paint like one polar side of the continuum. And if the other polar side of the continuum is, being drowned in your own self-pity, both of those extremes are bad. And so how do you find that place where you're, still showing up for yourself and still showing up for others? To get in before you get to the next question, just to round out that sort of the cancer part is the second flashpoint of my life. You also can't separate that from just a confluence of timing. I happened to be diagnosed in the December of 2018. And COVID hit, the pandemic hit it hit our shores really in, early spring or late winter, depending on where you were in 2020. Right. And so maybe 15 months later, and we didn't know at the time, we knew that CLL patients were suffering badly with medical outcomes. We didn't know what the numbers were, but eventually the peer-reviewed journal Nature did a retrospective study on the first year data coming out of COVID. And remember, like COVID, we didn't know what we knew now. Like at first they thought it was, physical contact and we were washing down groceries, right? And then they figured out it was airborne, but they didn't know exactly like how much so, and all that type of stuff, right? So we didn't know what we didn't know. We just knew that there were freezer trucks in, New York City with bodies in them, right? Because that was on the news. Well, Nature eventually did this study, and of like all the cohorts, take the elderly in nursing homes, take cancer patients who are under treatment, take, people with organ transplants. The worst medical outcomes were for people with CLL because our immune systems don't work right. And even like post-vaccine, right? We don't uptake vaccines because our B cells, well, you get a vaccine that tells your B cells, oh, this is a bad thing. Your B cells rally around that and train your T cells to attack it. Our B cells don't work. So our vaccine uptake is really bad. Like they don't have numbers for the COVID vaccine because it's still too new. But, for the flu shot, somewhere between 7 to 10% of CLL patients actually get a benefit from the flu shot. So, even once the vaccine came and we started doing more aggressive treatments around COVID, we were still in a very high risk cohort and continue to be, frankly. So we couldn't really separate my cancer diagnosis from COVID because that was the thing that created, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot about this strong desire to sort of isolate myself and sort of, by definition, then isolating my family because they're the close contact people around me. And that's not good for young kids, as we all saw with schooling.
But kids are that like enormous vector.
Yes.
Into a house too. So you can understand why you would want to do that.
Yes. So that became a tension, right? That we had to wrestle with at the time, right? Because it was this quite difficult, frankly, for me emotionally, this inversion of the parent-child relationship around safety. Instead of me keeping them safe, they were keeping me safe, which is not something you want to put on a 5-year-old. So like, how do you deal with that? So I'm sure we'll spend a lot more time talking about that, but sort of that's the arc to your big question. Like, how did I get here? It was this early introduction to vulnerability and mortality and both good and bad mental consequences that came out of that. Some of which, were good, that I trained myself to deal with some emotional and psychological issues. But then this big sort of cancer COVID family dynamic that kind of came into play.
So I need to ask, like, how I'm trying to like align this, somebody has this cancer diagnosis, you don't know when it's going to hit you.
Yeah.
And when did the high altitude climbing come into your life? Like, how did that all come together before that?
Okay. Once I mentioned the knee injury. Once I tore up my knee playing soccer, I was looking for, sort of naively then, I thought it was just a physical thing. Like I was looking for something to push me physically. And so I got into climbing. First with sort of peak bagging, which is sort of like a precursor to mountaineering. I live in Colorado, and we have, depending on how you count them, north of 50, 14,000 foot peaks 14,000 feet or above. And so I started out doing that, which is a very typical Colorado story, but many of those are just hiking at high altitude. Like, you might as well be a hiker. You just need to learn how altitude affects your body and how to mitigate some risk around that. But then eventually, I got into more technical forms of climbing around that. And then I kind of combined the two, taking the technicality of, ropes climbing that you would see, on rock faces to this sort of summit pursuing notion. And that kind of leads to this high altitude mountaineering thing that I got into. And so I started doing that well before the cancer diagnosis. In fact, I was planning my first trip to the Himalaya when I got the cancer diagnosis. And so then it was a big question of like, do I still go? Do I still want to do this thing? And I did eventually go on a trip in the fall of 2019. So right before COVID hit. So it wasn't the same sort of like risk dynamics around travel and all that type of stuff yet. But I originally went as this, object lesson. Like, I'm going to teach my kids that, it's still important to dream big, even when you have these unchosen risks thrown at you. So it's sort of this weird juxtaposition of a very chosen set of risks around going above 7,000 meters. And I was attempting an unclimbed peak. So it wasn't like I was out on a commercial expedition with people, showing me the way. It was like, no, we're going to figure out everything ourselves. We don't know what's around the next corner. We don't know what the rock fall, ice fall, all those types of hazards are going to be. And of course, altitude is its own hazard and cold is its own hazard. But here's the set of chosen risks. and sort of juxtaposed against this unchosen risk of this cancer diagnosis. And what I thought I was doing at the time, and I've since reframed it, and I'm sure we'll get into that, was this sort of like, dreams are important. They're oxygen for us. They're sustaining. And so kids, even when life throws you a giant curveball, you need to keep having dreams. It's that forward propulsion. It pulls us. And that's what I thought I was going to be teaching them with this trip to the Himalaya. It ended up looking very different after COVID came because COVID was far more risky than the mountains were, which was interesting.
So have you resumed that since?
Very recently.
Yeah.
I really went like 4 years without ever going to an airport. Just crowded places. Like, I still avoid them because I have to view them from a risk reward lens. Like I don't go to concerts, I don't go to bars, those types of things. I'm not as scared of COVID as I was back then because the avoidance is still a problem for me, but the treatments have gotten so much better, mostly because not that we have a whole bunch of new tools. Obviously the vaccine is a new tool, but it's limited in its ability to help me. But the treatments are just done more aggressively. Doctors get in quickly. We do have a few new tools like Paxlovid, which is sure it's not going to stop you from getting a COVID rebound, but it's going to stop you from getting in the hospital. And I did actually eventually get COVID once, and I did go on Paxlovid about a year ago now, I think probably. And yes, I did get the COVID rebound, but no, I didn't go to the hospital. And so that sort of worked for me. So I don't have the same notion of risk that I did 4 years ago, when, the percentages according to this nature, if you ended up with moderate to severe COVID and you had CLL, you had a 38% chance of dying. 38%, a third of you, if you get moderate to severe, are going to die. So avoidance was the only strategy.
Yeah.
That's no longer the case, but, it still gets into this weird risk reward. Like, do I really want to see this movie that bad?
Yeah. Wait until I can see it on my 70-inch television in the living room.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
So there is still that. But I did, like I said, I hadn't gone to an airport in forever, but then we finally did go overseas as a family. We did the trek of the Tour de Mont Blanc, which isn't a mountaineering trip. But we flew over to Europe and we did the 103-mile hike around Mont Blanc from, Italy into Switzerland into France. And
that was the whole family.
And that was the whole family. And we did that just last summer. And that was the first time I'd traveled since the pandemic. So I'm starting to, come out the other side. And a lot of that, and I'm sure this will be a subject of a lot more of what we talk about, but it's a lot of that is because I had shrunk my kids' world down so small.
Yeah.
And right at the age where their world's supposed to be getting big. And it was no longer acceptable to me to make the same trade-offs that I had been making, probably detrimentally to all of us, but certainly to them for 3-4 years at least.
So how did it work? I'm curious about, you and your boys have this YouTube channel about getting families out into the wild.
Sure.
I'm assuming you got out into the wild to do those things. And you live in Colorado, which I'm extremely jealous of because every time I visited, I'm like, why don't I live out here? It's beautiful out here. And then I look at the housing prices and I go, oh, that's why I don't live out here. But yeah.
Right.
But how did that work? Like, how did that evolve and emerge? That you
the YouTube channel started, again, sort of a confluence of things. I think the major push was that my boys asked me. First, it started with Connor. Connor and Cade are my boys' names. And Connor said, you should do a YouTube channel about, us getting outside. And I was kind of like, well, I don't want to expose my family to that because there's certainly some toxicity that can come around all of that stuff if not managed right. And then eventually he recruited his brother. And so Cade was asking me too. I was like, we should do a YouTube channel. It's like, okay. But then sort of bringing it into blending it into other realms of my life. So like, well, what if we do it educationally? So everything that I'm teaching my kids, in essence, I can record what I'm teaching them. And then that's a tutorial, a how-to manual for other parents who want to get their kids out. And so when they were younger, it was, mostly about like hiking and camping. And, certainly we did a little bit of technical climbing, but it was not as technical and risky as it is now, as they've gotten bigger and better and able to handle responsibilities better. But I just sort of, as their needs for pushing their next level of life in the outdoors, ramps up, then so does the technicality of the video itself. And so kind of, if you go back in time, it's going to be very young, family friendly. And now as you go forward, 3 or 4 years, it's getting, much more sophisticated in its level of technique.
How is your relationship with your boys kind of developed around that?
The best part about it is when we go out, and obviously we're filming stuff, weeks to months later, we're reliving that. It's not the home movie that like you and I can appreciate this, younger families probably can't, but, back in the old, 8mm or even VHS days, right? They go into a box and that box goes in the upper shelf of the closet and it comes out like 3 times in your life, oh yeah, let's go look at the Grand Canyon trip again. Well, now we relive it, the next week or weeks following it. And so every time we go out, we get to relive that adventure a little bit. And to me, that's been one of the largest rewards, is that it gives us that chance to bond both in the act, but then after. And I think most of our seminal events in our lives tend to have that sort of that metacognition about it as you process it. And so having a mechanism, even if it's sort of contrived, of making a tutorial video, it's nonetheless creates this mechanism of us having that metacognition, that reliving of the experience. And so we can talk about it again, and it brings us a little bit closer.
As much as I might kind of sound like the get off my lawn old guy some days about, social media and, what it's done, I would pay to have digital copies of those experiences, from childhood, because at this point, I don't even remember if something is made up in my head, if it's a memory that's just on top of a memory on top of a memory,
I can relate.
Or if it was real, like what was the real thing? And maybe there's a beauty in that, but I would love to, have some of those really important moments to be able to relive.
Well, to your point, and this is one of the things that maybe I draw from the mountains the most, actually, is that you said maybe there's a beauty about not having those digital memories, because, I imagine part of what you're alluding to is it kind of forces you to be more present rather than looking at the experience through the screen that you're filming from. But like everything has pros and cons. Everything has good and bad, right? So I can look, I just waxed, poetically about this relived experience with my kids. But to your point, there is the downside of like, sometimes that means I'm running ahead and setting up the tripod in order to get the shot of us walking through the thing. So there is downsides to it too. And that's like one of the things that maybe mountains teaches you the most, is that there are no solutions. There's just, what problems are you willing to take on? It's, there's whole problems you can avoid. And then there's, like, we're not going to go out in the middle of this lightning storm. We're just going to avoid that problem altogether. But that means that then we're going to deal with, warmer temperatures and dehydration, just to paint the other extreme, if we go out on the sunnier bluebird day kind of thing. So you're always choosing risks. You're always choosing downsides. And as long as you're self-aware about what downsides you're choosing, you can, I think when framed well, that means you can also sort of embrace the positive sides of that thing that you're willing to take on. So to your point about like, you can dog on social media, but wouldn't it be great to have those memories? As long as you can remember to frame it that way and go, because that's a choice, right? It's like, there are some downsides to this, but I'm going to embrace the good part of it as well. So
I want to switch to a different segment of the episode, and I think that when we have this, the tagline of the podcast is men with good hearts and open minds who want to make the world a better place, and I almost think that to sort of fit into that criteria, you have to have this growth mindset. And so to me, part of growth has always been like, there are things that we grow up with foundationally that we then need to deconstruct and then rebuild.
Yes.
Right. Because they don't fit us anymore.
Yes.
So I wanted to know, like, what are those foundational things that you've had to deconstruct as you've kind of grown into the man that you are?
Sure. I was always a achievement oriented, teenager and young adult. And obviously I still try to achieve things. I don't think I've fully deprogrammed myself of that. And I'm not sure I'd want to. You don't go try to unclimb peaks in the Himalayas without having a fairly big ego, and having that ego touch maybe a little too strongly on the notion of accomplishment. But I think, to your point about deconstructing that, again, sort of like finding the balance of achievement versus journey, like the process of achievement versus the outcome of achievement, because part of doing hard things means you don't actually achieve them all the time. And so can you become a process oriented person and still have the goal? I still want to get to this summit and home safely, but, can I enjoy that process because the summit isn't a given? Because I don't climb the types of things where the summit is a given. And also, I don't think there's a lot of growth that would come from doing things that are that easily achieved. So I think that's like one example of it. Again, the ego, like embracing the fact that I have an ego, rather than fighting against it. I think that was the mistake of like maybe my late 20s, my early 30s, is sort of, again, going too far the other way and going, well, ego is bad. You go, well, no, untamed ego is bad.
Yeah.
And so when I learned to dance with my ego rather than push against it, I've gotten to a better place of self-acceptance. And of course, self-acceptance is foundational to almost all human relationships, at least healthy ones. And so, again, I don't think I always get it right. And there are days that I get too wrapped up in my ego. And there are days that I get too vitrolic against my own venality. But there are many more days now where I find the balance point in that, where, I'm a pretty good person, but I'm also a work in progress. And when I can hold those two seemingly contradictory thoughts in my head at the same time, I'm a healthier, better me. And so I think that would be an example. I think I've gotten progressively better at self-forgiveness. A lot of my emotional trauma coming out of the cancer diagnosis was the fact that I wasn't going to be able to protect my kids from this eventually. Like someday treatment will happen and that treatment will be uncertain. And as much as I have this idealized version of fatherhood of, sort of protecting my kids from these types of, dark uncertainties, like I'm going to bring one home to them one day. And there's almost no avoiding it. And again, on my good days, I can forgive myself for that. On my bad days, I have a hard time with it. But having the dialectic in my head around those poles is again, when like I tend to be a better version of myself, is accepting that this is just going to be the theme of me. And certain people might disagree with it, but I still buy into that sort of like moderation in all things. And I tend to live my life from like, I can see the bads in these extreme polarized versions of all sorts of things, how I spend my time, how I treat myself, how I treat others. And I'm better when I'm somewhere in the middle. And so my life's project, sort of the heart of your question about deconstructing things, has been trying to identify how those poles, those extreme versions show up in my own life, being able to recognize them so that I can try and pull myself towards the middle. And I'm never done. I'm never done, because I will always pull a little too far back. And then I got to push that pendulum back the other way again some more. And so I tend to think of like this mental image of a grandfather clock in my head all the time. The pendulum swings from side to side. And I sort of view my life's project as trying to get that pendulum to swing less and less and less and less. And there are times where I do it well, and there are times that I don't. But I'm happiest when I'm getting smaller pendulum swings.
Yeah. So what are the personal development things that you're working on right now? Like, are there one or two things that are?
I am constantly working on trying to be more openly communicative, which I alluded to kind of earlier in our conversation. I mean, that is, 15 years of training myself to internalize my own dialogue. And it started out as internalizing my own pain, and then it became such a habit that it would even internalize my own joy. And that makes me not a particularly interesting person to be around. Right? Right.
Yeah, it's not fun or interesting, right?
Right, exactly.
If you keep everything to yourself. Yeah.
Exactly. Oh, there's that person who's not easy to impress and not easy to piss off. And they go, well, again, like, I don't want to be a person who's rah and thinking that everything is ecstatic. I also don't want to be a person who is completely finds everything banal and uninteresting, and or even go to another extreme where everything is just stupid and be cynical about it. Right? None of that is good. And so I think trying to value myself enough to let the that internal dialogue out and share it with the people who care about me, and sometimes people who are just getting to know me, right? And being open to that vulnerability, back to that part of the conversation, is constantly what I'm working on, because like I said, I trained myself so studiously, not consciously, but studiously, but 15 years of hard practice of just not saying what I was feeling. So it's not going to break easy.
Yeah. It never does. Right. It's, you mentioned cynicism and not wanting to sort of fall into that cynicism. Cynicism is actually really easy. Like there's this natural default towards it. When things aren't going the way you want them to go, it's really easy to just get jaded about things.
Yes.
Like choosing joy and choosing gratitude is like incredibly hard to do on most days. But when you find it, it's rewarding, right? It's more rewarding than any cynicism will ever be.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And, to put another layer on top of that, like, I actually have a very cynical sense of humor. I like theater of the absurd. And I find a lot of human endeavor to be kind of absurd, right? If you think about just, office dynamics, right? How many things around office dynamics can you just sort of easily make fun of? And the weird thing about that is, the other layer is, I don't want to lose that part of my humor. So the trick is, can I have a cynical sense of humor, but laugh it off as absurd, and still be earnest about, trying to do well as a professional and trying to advance the mission of my company, and trying to be a good colleague and a good boss and a good, employee, and all those types of, because again, contradictory thoughts. I want to have both of those things, because I also don't want to be so earnest that, like, you can't joke around with Jason. You can't find the humor in that office bingo using the jargon terms, oh, I can't believe they just used that acronym again. I don't want to be that person. No, this is very serious, and we're here doing God's work all the time. Go, well, that guy isn't good either. And so back to the balance point. Yeah, cynicism is too easy. And of the two traps, I do fall into that trap more easily, where it's just everything is cynical and everything is absurd and there isn't any joy in anything. But I try to balance that against earnestness, because being the overly earnest person, I want to be earnest about some things, but I can't be earnest all the time, or I become a caricature.
Yeah, it's. I think that, like, the end of human society will be when we lose stand-up comedy. Like, I really do, because it has changed. It has certainly changed, and probably for the better over the last decade or so. But there's something about laughing at the absurdity of things that is kind of uniquely human, I think. And if we don't have that, we end up taking ourselves far too seriously.
Yes. I would tend to agree. I actually really love stand-up comedy. I think, to your point, like, we've seen it migrate to different forms of late. People can argue around the edges of whether that's a good or bad transformation. I think, I generalize the rule that as long as you're not punching down, whatever that means, like whatever marginalized, like, you can make fun of yourself all you want, You can make fun of the tribe that you're in all you want. You can make fun of, the people who, in whatever context you're talking about, have more power than you. You can make fun of that too. Just don't punch down. That I think that's a fair. You can still find a lot of humor in the world.
That's a great way of putting it. So you talked a lot about isolation with COVID and with your cancer diagnosis. Some people would say that isolation is the opposite of community. And community is something that's incredibly important to me. It's something that I want to have kind of as a theme running through these podcast episodes. So who, you mentioned you see a therapist. Who or what do you rely on for support beyond that? And I'm not minimizing the therapy because it's incredibly important. I've benefited from it myself. And I think the world would be a better place if more men actually saw therapists. But where do you find community outside of that, or in connection?
Sure.
Yeah.
I am fortunate to have a climbing community who bond over, back to sort of earnestness. When we go up in the mountains, sure, we laugh and we have a good time and we tell off-color jokes and all those things that you would expect from a still fairly hyper masculine. Climbing is becoming more accessible to women, but if you go into the high altitude circles, it's still like 10% women. Some of that's physiological because they get colder easier, generally as a gender, but it's also, cultural and just, not letting women have opportunities. But anyway, it's still this very sort of masculine sphere and all of the stuff that comes with that, both good and bad. But on the good side of the climbing community is, not hyperbolically, we literally hold each other's lives in our hands on a regular basis. If I let go of the rope running through my belay device, when the leader up above me falls, that leader will continue to fall and they will eventually hit the ground. So while it's not complicated, it is quite a level of trust. And sure, as you go into complex environments like high altitude environments or alpine environments, things get complicated. But if you can just imagine a rope being tied to a person, being clipped through things that are attached to a rock wall, so that if the person falls, the thing catches the rope so they'd stop falling. The whole reason that system works is because if you follow that rope down, it goes through a belay device at my waist and my hand is on the other end of the rope. I just cannot let go of the rope. That is the rules, no matter what. If that fall creates upward force and I get pulled off my feet and up into the rock wall, tough. I will not let go of the rope. If a rock fall comes down from an alpine environment and hits me in the shoulder, tough. I will not let go of the rope because it is the number one rule. So there is earnestness around that. And there is a bonding that comes from that, both from doing hard things, but then also sort of having each other's lives in their hands. There is quite a blending of military veteran community and the climbing community. And while I can't claim to be a military veteran, talking to them, fairly universally, they will say, people, veterans who do become climbers will say this is the only sphere where they can find that same type of camaraderie. And I think it comes down to that because it is life and death.
And they're trusting you with their lives.
Yeah. So that's one major sphere of community. I think I have a childhood friend, a kid I grew up with. I think we met when we were around 10. And just through confluence of events, we now both live in Colorado and roughly in the Denver metro area while I'm on the north side and he's on the south side. So we can still see each other and we have that long history. And I think that's important for some of our relationships, someone who knew me growing up. Of course, there's my family. But, another conscious thing that we did is we live not in the house because we're fortunate enough that we can make this choice. Not everyone would be able to, but we live multi-generationally. My parents live next door. Wow. We didn't want necessarily next door, but we wanted the same general neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so when we made this last move up here, we asked my parents, "Hey, do you want to move too? Are you willing to do it?" They said yes. A lot of that is to be near the grandkids. They had moved around a little bit. I have an older brother who got married sooner and started having kids sooner, age-wise. So they had moved away and did some time trailing around with him to be around their grandkids. They did the same thing with us. But as I think about that and some of the benefits of it, and we think about sort of constraints on our lives and men's typical role in those lives, this is going to sound really antiseptic, maybe a little robotic, but I think it's true. If you think about time and energy and money as like three major resources that we blend together to make a familial experience, my parents have time because they're retired. My wife and I both are earners, and so we have income, but we don't have as much time. And our kids, who are 10, have energy. So there's all something that we can contribute to that equation to help my parents stay independent longer. We can shovel their driveway or whatever it is, so that they can not be in a assisted facility for as long as that's possible. And they can watch the kids after school. And my wife and I are still winding down our work days. We both work remotely. The kids can help my parents cook. They love cooking of all things. Besides all the climbing and stuff, they love cooking. And so they can help with meals. And so they can bring energy to that equation. There's a youthful exuberance, I think, that comes with just seeing the world with new eyes that helps both my wife and I and my parents stay young. So there's all something that we bring to this dynamic. And so we find a lot of community in that. And then once you have kids, I'm sure, then there's, the play dates and, the friends of the kids who are into the same things. And so there's a little bit of that. That's not as strong for us, at least not the way it was when I was a kid, where it was much more free range and I would just run, down the street, 25 houses to my friend's house. That's not the way the world is so much anymore. Some for good reasons and some for bad. But there is still nonetheless, the parents from the robotics club and, those types of things that my kids are in.
That is something that is like really changed. I mean, I had the same experience as you, kind of free range, kick out after breakfast, come back for lunch, get kicked out again and come back for dinner. And, never saw the inside of a house if the weather was good. And my son, he was raised in a like incredibly good, safe neighborhood. And hardly ever played with kids in the neighborhood. He had great friends, great community, but they didn't live anywhere near us. And it's just the culture is completely different in that way.
Yeah, everything's scheduled now. Some of it I think came from the scheduling. Some of it came from safety, but yet now it's it's just not like that. But sort of blend your last 2 points, your 2 questions, sort of growth mindset and community. If I were to generalize my community around a concept, it is that concept of growth mindset. My community is made up of people. We're not always doing hard things together, but we do hard things together, whether that's raising 2 young humans, so my parents, or that's going out and climbing. And even if we're not doing, death-defying Himalayan climbs, we're just going out to the local crag, it's still hard. We're still trying to, moves that are hard for us physically or whatever it is. So people that we do hard things with from time to time so that we grow together in struggle tends to make up the people who make up my community.
That's a great way of putting it. Like doing hard things together. I like that. That's the bond. That's wonderful. So I want to switch to our lightning round, which is the wrap up of the episode. Got 11 questions that I'm going to throw at you real fast. You don't need to think real deeply on them. Just kind of give me what your reactions are to them. So what are your top 3 values?
Vulnerability, strength and vulnerability certainly is one. A particular form of integrity I learned from my father, which is when you say you're going to do something, it's a verbal contract at all times. You follow through on that. Sure, you might have to be late, but alert them. You might have to do it differently, but alert them. But you don't just drop it. You figure out a way to get a version of it done. So that type of do what you say what you do integrity. And because it's the one that I struggle with the most, being communicative, I actually think that's a value. For the reason that I described earlier, that when I'm not communicative, I'm robbing the other person in the relationship of being a partner, because it becomes a one-way street. both through communication and from help. And so I think that's a major value of mine as well.
Okay. Who is one role model you've had in your life that you would kind of single out?
Well, I already mentioned my dad. He was one of those guys that just, he didn't say, hey, maybe we should build a clubhouse. He showed up with the engineering schematics of what we were going to build. He didn't say, maybe we should get the basketball hoop. The poles were laying next to the driveway and the concrete bags were next to the pole digger. Like, he was just one of those guys who, and he still is, I'm just in the past tense, but I'm thinking about it from my youth, who combined two things that you heard in me discuss earlier, that he did what he said he was going to do. But the other maybe lost part, because it's implied, is that he did things. He did things. He built the clubhouse. That's like, a month of his life coming home from work and working on it, and every weekend spent on it. And so while it's not a hard thing climbing a mountain, it's a hard thing. It's, thinking through how to do that, making sure it's safe because your kids are going to be climbing all over it. There's a lot that goes into that kind of thing. So to be the kind of person who does what they say they will do, don't overlook the preamble to that of doing things.
Yeah. So who do you hope you're a role model for?
Well, certainly my kids first and foremost. I hope they see me working on myself, being an active participant in the construction of my own character, thinking about who I want to be and trying to develop habits to be that person, and inevitably coming up short, but trying anyway, rather than just letting circumstances shape my character. Like, no, making it an active verb. I'm going to attempt to become who I want to become. And sure, sometimes I'll get knocked sideways and I'll become something else, like a guy who holds back on communication for 15 years. Okay, but can I get past that? Can I become something else? So they're first and foremost. And then I hope that that bleeds into the rest of that community that I mentioned. I hope that the people who trust me to do hard things with them also see that part of my character. It's not just holding the rope. It's the person who is trying to become the kind of person you want to hold the rope.
So what's the one way you make the world a better place for others?
Oh gosh, I hope I do. I once had someone tell me, as long as you love your kids, you'll never screw it up too badly. We'll all screw it up to degrees. It's just, you'll never screw it up too badly. So sort of leaning on that, and back to the person who's trying to craft his own character. I hope what I bring to the world is that I'm trying to be a positive influence in the world. And that doesn't mean that I am at every moment, but it's, the fact that you love your kids, you won't screw up, the fact that I'm trying, that I actually try. And I try hard. I work at it really hard. Probably because it is difficult for me. And maybe that, more than accomplishing anything, back to our conversation about accomplishing summits or accomplishing goals, I was valedictorian of my high school. I accomplished a thing. It's more in the trying. It's more so the legacy is in the effort, not in I gave so much to charity, or I mentored these groups of employees in their career, or I, established this great project that helped this many people in healthcare. Those are important, but I think the grander theme is in the trying.
What's the hardest thing about being you in today's world?
I'm going to give you two answers because I don't know how to compare them. There is just I'm at physical risk. I just am. And that's hard. It's hard because I have people who rely on me, and I have kids who need me. And, would they get through life if I died? Yes, they would. Would it be better if I didn't? I'd like to think it would. So there's that. There's just the physical risk part of it. But with that comes sort of the psychological anguish side of that, where we make bad decisions, where my kids are, keeping me safe, and that inversion of the parent-child relationship, and I'm supposed to keep them safe, not vice versa, and going too far down that road, and all those types of difficulties. Balance is hard. And so back to my big theme about, pendulums and trying to hold the pendulum in place. Like, in some ways it's easier to go all out at something, to just put your foot down and go, I'm going to be monomaniacal about X. Balance is hard because you never get it right. And so I think that's the hardest part about being me, is that I'm choosing a difficult path.
What's your favorite emotion?
Joy, but particularly joy through laughter.
Mm-hmm.
There's all sorts of different kinds of joy, but there's an abandonment that comes through laughter, even if it's dark humor. When it's dark humor, it's a balm. When it's light humor, it's this. I never see myself being as present as when I'm just laughing at something.
Yeah.
I'm not thinking about my 401k or my kids' college fund or any of those things. Like, I'm just laughing at the thing, the joke, or the thing that happened.
It's beautifully overwhelming.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I compartmentalize, and I'm always a very distracted personality. Not when I'm laughing. It's just that thing.
Yeah. What's your least favorite emotion?
Probably anger. I resent my anger, and that's not healthy. I'm not proud of it. Again, that's the pendulum too far. I think that I'm not a particularly angry person. I'm not violent. I don't get in fights. I tend to turn the other cheek. But that doesn't mean that I don't feel anger. And I wish I felt it less. And I think the resentment comes from, I'm aware that I've both trained myself, and that, for better or for worse, it's the glide path our society creates for men. When things go wrong, you are allowed to be angry. I think that's a little bit of BS. But I also think that, we get well trained, and I think my resentment comes from that. And so I tend to battle against my anger, hopefully in good ways. Because life, like I said, is really friggin' hard, and I do things that are hard. And so I'm defeated a lot. And so it'd be easy to just be angry all the time. And so I try not to be.
What brings you the most joy in life?
I couldn't have said this until I have kids, and I alluded to it earlier. It's them, but of all the things about them, and there's many things about them, their budding personalities and what they're getting interested in, all that sort of stuff. When they see something new, and I'm allowing myself to see that through their eyes, I rediscover awe and wonder. I very much remember the first time my kids saw snow, and I went, they were amazed. They were just like, wow, and then I allowed myself the freedom to go, that is amazing. It really is. Like, think about the scientific phenomena of fluffy, crystalline, frozen stuff falling from the sky that doesn't hurt you, that is kind of cool but soft at the same time. It is flippin' amazing. And when I let myself see it like they do, that is the best experience.
I want to take it aside because I love the way you described that, because it was a semi-scientific way of describing something that, when you really understand what's happening, you can almost see divine in it at the same time. right?
Yes.
So science and the divine are not at opposition to one another.
No. Yes. You couldn't have said it better. Absolutely. Science and the divine. And the same reason why I am drawn to documentaries and like biographies and autobiographies. I think our experience in the world is amazing enough. Like, I don't need to, that doesn't mean that I don't like Star Wars or I didn't think Indiana Jones was cool. But when you talk about the things that I really emotionally invest in, it's true stories. Because I think the truth is far more amazing than the stories we concoct.
I have a huge library. There are 2 books of fiction in that entire library, both by the same author, because there's so much fascinating that's
Yes.
real.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Back to the questions. What makes you most proud of yourself?
I'm proud of myself most when I consciously defeat my weaknesses. So if right now, going back to the theme of like communication, and that's the thing I'm working on the most, and that's the thing I have the hardest time with, like, again, like real story. When I got my cancer diagnosis, I was in the dentist's office when they told me I had to go back to the lab. I didn't have my diagnosis yet. I'd gone to the primary care physician the day before, physical, and I was doing all the routine maintenance. So I went to the dentist the next day. So I'm in the dentist's office, calls me up. I recognize the doctor's office on my caller ID, answer it. And they're like, you need to get into the lab today. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, your white blood cell count is really high. Go today. Right. And they're trying to not tell me, but tell me at the same time. And like, I'm having this weird, out of body, surreal experience about it. So anyways, like I finished the dental appointment and I have this very conscious dialogue in my head. Said, you're going to call Christy. Christy's my wife, Christina. You're going to call Christy and you're going to tell her. You don't have anything to say yet. You don't know what it is. You don't know why they want you there. But you got some ideas and you're going to call her. And even though it's going to be a bunch of speculation on your part, you're going to call her and you're going to tell her. And that might sound like small potatoes to most people in the world. But for me, that was a big deal because that was exactly the kind of thing that I would hold on to because I don't know all the facts yet because it hasn't reached resolution and I don't want someone worrying about me. And so I can make up the story in my head of, well, once I know what's going on so that they're not worrying needlessly, that's when I'll tell them.
Yeah.
But I didn't do it.
I'm exactly the same way. Like exactly the same way. It's like I want to have all the information before I present it to somebody.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I'm doing them some favor by freeing them from having to deal with the unknown. But again, back to that, like, but that's not a partnership.
Yeah.
So like that would be an example of like, yeah, I was proud of myself when I consciously made that choice. Maybe one day I'll be very proud of myself when I start doing that stuff unconsciously because it'll mean it's a habit. But I'm not there yet.
Okay. Where can you feel the most yourself?
Lots of places. This is one thing that maybe I do pretty well. I do lots of things poorly, but when I go to the mountains, I'm myself and I'm more in the moment because particularly when I'm doing hard versions of the mountains, like it requires your attention.
You have to.
Or you'll die. Around my family, obviously I can be who I am. And that doesn't mean that I don't have character flaws and that it doesn't create fights and all those things that happen in households. It does. But I also don't have to feel guilty about being a work in progress. And so I can be myself around family. And one of the blessings that I've taken from cancer, because again, everything has pros and cons, even cancer, is that at work, I bring more of my authentic self than I ever did. Because the alternative became untenable because I would have bad days where I had an oncology appointment and trying to pretend that I was going to care about the meeting right after the oncology appointment was doing a disservice to the company. And so eventually, and to myself. And so eventually I just said, I have this thing and here's what it does to me. And on a long-term basis, and here's what it does to me on a daily basis. And I'm going to tell you when I'm having a bad day. And I'm lucky that I work in a place where they let me do that, because actually they will coach people with non-presenting, so no physical symptoms that you can see, non-presenting cancers, to not tell their employers. That's what most advocacy organizations will tell you, because it can lead to all sorts of like both conscious and unconscious, like, well, we shouldn't give this guy a promotion because, he might need treatment in a while, right? And so there's lots of good reasons to do that, but I couldn't do it. I didn't have the ability to compartmentalize well enough to be a professional over here and be a cancer patient over there. And so I brought them together, and I was lucky that I had a place that was understanding of that and let me do it.
Okay, as we wrap up today, one last question. What's the one thing you hope people take away from this conversation?
This is going to start off weird, but I'll bring it around. That we overly celebrate exceptionalism. That, and this gets back to the whole thing about balance, that, like I can look at the world-class athletes who sort of by definition have to be monomaniacal. You don't become an Olympian unless you live that, right? You don't become a NFL player unless you live that. I mean, some people do around the edges, but let's say that they're more focused on one thing than the general population. And we have a tendency, particularly in our American culture, and it really is America, it's not just Western, to really celebrate that. We celebrate the billionaires, and we celebrate the superstar athletes, and we celebrate the once in a generation, talents, whether that be musicians or actors or whatever it is. And we look at these people, of which, there's a handful on the planet, and we go, those people are incredible. And back to the biographies and the documentaries and the needing to find balance, I think that there's really incredible, undeniable beauty in what we would think of as the mundane. Trying to live a balanced life, trying to be a good husband and good father, or a good partner, or a good employee, or like the things that we all get up and try to do every day. And I think that is way harder than the person who has the whole support structure behind them to be the generational athletic talent. Like, we're all out here figuring this crap out ourselves and trying to balance these things that pull from each other in the short term and figuring it out as we go. And while that might feel like, well, that's really unremarkable, I think it's incredibly remarkable. So I think if there's one thing to take away, it's celebrate the middle of the bell curve. Like, and I can say that maybe from a place of like, not many people high altitude climb, and not many people are valedictorian, and not many people are fellowship winners, and not many people get to be analytics leaders. And so maybe I am in one of those tails, but not in all the spheres of my life. In most of those spheres that matter, good partner, good father, good colleague, I'm just a guy in the middle. And it's taken me many, many years to figure out that that's, I think, worth celebrating.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your story with me and with our viewers. Hopefully your story will be out there widely in a few weeks. So I just want to, again, thank you for taking the time today. It's been an absolute pleasure of mine speaking with you, and look forward to staying in touch.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and for listening to me drivel on, and hopefully some good comes out of it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jason.
Take care.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
You can learn more about Illuminate at illuminate.substack.com. We are also streaming on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and YouTube. Thanks for listening and watching, and we'll see you at the next episode of Illuminate.